In our village, they say that kindness can feed 1,000 mouths, but greed will starve even the fullest belly. What I'm about to tell you is not just a story about why Kwaku Anansi caused spiders to have thin waists. No. This is a tale of how the cleverest creature in all our lands lost everything. Not because he was hungry, but because he couldn't see that a feast without honor is more bitter than an empty pot. Sit with me, dear viewers, as I tell you the tale of how the great spider lost his shape and almost his soul to the deadliest hunger of all, the hunger for more than your fair share. But before we begin this tale, my wonderful viewers who haven't subscribed, please click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the powerful lessons taught in stories and folk tales from African mythology. In the village of Akwamu, where the sun painted the earth golden and the wind carried whispers of ancient wisdom, Anansi the spider was known for his silver tongue and clever mind. Kwaku Anansi, the villagers would say. His words are sweeter than honey, but his heart is another matter entirely. You see, Anansi had grown accustomed to a life of luxury. Wherever there was a feast, you would find him, perched at the head of the table, telling his famous stories while stuffing himself with the finest foods. "Hey, pass me more fufu," he would call out, his belly growing rounder with each bite. How can I tell proper stories without proper food in my belly? But then the great famine struck. The land dried up like a leaf in Harmattan. The crops withered, the rivers shrank, and even the mighty baobab trees seemed to weep for the people's suffering. "Kai, this will not do," Anansi grumbled, watching from his web, as villagers shared what little food they had left. His 8 eyes narrowed as he saw a family splitting a single yam between 6 people. How can they expect someone of my importance to live like this?" Anansi's stomach growled so loudly that nearby birds took flight in fear. But this discomfort sparked an idea in his clever mind. An idea so wicked, so cunning, that even the night wind seemed to hold its breath as he thought it through. Why didn't I think of this before?" He chuckled to himself, rubbing his front legs together. In times of famine, people might not feast for celebrations, but they will always feast for funerals. You see, dear listener, in our tradition, funerals last for 3 sacred days. The first day is for the heaviest mourning, the wailing and crying that releases our grief. The second day, we celebrate the life of those we've lost with music and dance. The third day is for sharing meals and telling stories about the departed. Anansi, knowing this sacred tradition, began to dig between Akwamu and Bonwire, villages just far enough apart that news traveled slowly. He created a secret tunnel. His 8 legs worked tirelessly, and his web-spinning abilities made possible what no human trickster could achieve. Anansi's spider form gave him advantages no human trickster could match. His 8 legs could move swiftly through the dark tunnel, and his ability to spin web ropes would make his scheme possible. Spinning 2 identical ropes from his strongest spider silk, Anansi began his plan in Akwamu. "Ewo, Ewo, what a tragedy," he cried, rolling in the dust as villagers gathered around. "My dear family in Bonwire, all of them, gone." He beat his chest dramatically, tears flowing from all 8 eyes. "Anansi, take heart," the village chief said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We may not have much, but we will honor your family with a proper funeral feast." But Anansi wasn't finished. He tied one of his spider silk ropes around his waist, letting the other end disappear into his secret tunnel. "In my family's tradition," he explained, his voice trembling with fake emotion, "this sacred rope connects me to my grieving relatives in the other village. When I move, they feel my sorrow. When I eat, they are comforted. The villagers murmured, but before anyone could question him further, "Oh, the sorrow!" he wailed, rushing away. "My stomach! These emotions. I need a moment." Then, quick as lightning, while the villagers prepared the feast, Anansi scurried through his tunnel to Bonwire. There, he tied the second rope around his waist, letting this end also disappear into his tunnel. He told the same story, but this time claiming his family in Akwamu had died. "These tears, they run right through me. I must... Excuse me," he cried, dashing off while the villagers of Bonwire began preparations for the funeral feast. "Poor Anansi," the villagers said, "grief affects everyone differently." The tunnel was his secret pathway, you see. When the feasts began, Anansi would dash back and forth through the tunnel, appearing at each feast just long enough to eat and wail before rushing to the other side. There he was, racing between two funeral feasts, his 8 eyes darting back and forth and his belly growing fuller with each dash between villages, though keeping track of which story he told, where would soon prove more difficult than the running itself. A small boy in Akwamu tugged at his mother's wrapper, pointing at Anansi. "Mama, why does his belly grow bigger on one side and then the other?" "Hey, what kind of talk is that?" Anansi quickly interrupted, sweat forming on his brow. "In my family's tradition, grief settles differently in different parts of the body. You see, this side mourns my uncle. That side mourns my aunt. More conto mireille stew, my poor deceased aunt made it just like this. Or was it my uncle, my dear departed, someone loved conto mireille?" But the real trouble began when both villagers decided to honor him with his favorite dish, palm nut soup with fresh snails. The aroma hit all 8 of his nostrils at once. "Hey, this soup," he exclaimed sadly in Akwamu, where he should have been celebrating. "Chai, this soup!" he cried, dancing in Bonwire, where he should have been deep in sorrow. Anansi, a concerned woman in Bonwire, asked, "Why do you sound like you're dancing? This morning you could barely stand from grief, and now, oh, these are tears of joy," he quickly explained. "In my family's tradition, we dance our sorrow. Yes, the harder you dance, the deeper your grief. It's a special custom for this day of mourning." But in Akwamu, he was facing a different problem. "Anansi," the chief's wife observed, "why does the rope keep pulling you toward the ground?" That's because my relatives are lying down in their grief. Yes, in our tradition, we must stay connected to their rolling sorrow." This explanation turned out to be Anansi's undoing, as seeing how effectively it worked in Akwamu, he repeated the lie in Bonwire. Both villages took his words to heart and began taking turns pulling gently on the rope, believing they were helping him honor his tradition. "Pull softly," they would say, "so Anansi's family feels our support." "Keep the rope moving," they would remind each other, to share in their grief. Even when Anansi wasn't present in their village, the people would continue pulling the rope, thinking they were participating in his mourning ritual. The rope would disappear into his tunnel, and they would pull and release, pull and release, believing their actions brought comfort to the grieving relatives on the other end. The more he ate, the more complicated this became. His belly grew so large that the rope around his waist began to dig into his flesh. Yet still, his greed wouldn't let him stop. "Just one more bite," he thought, reaching for another bowl of fufu in Akwamu. "Just one more taste," he mumbled, grabbing more palm nut soup in Bonwire. Then it happened. While Anansi was in Akwamu, stuffing his face with his seventh bowl of fufu, a curious child noticed something strange about the rope. "Mama," the child said, tugging at his mother's wrapper, "when we pull the rope to share Anansi's grief, why doesn't it pull back the same way? Sometimes it pulls hard, sometimes soft, and sometimes not at all." The child's observation spread through the crowd in Akwamu. The villagers began to whisper among themselves. Indeed, how can grieving relatives pull so differently? They gathered around their end of the rope, ready to test this mystery with one mighty pull. At that exact moment in Bonwire, where the other end of the rope lay seemingly still, an elder stood up. "Brothers and sisters," he announced, "let us show Anansi's family the strength of our support. Everyone, grab the rope. We will all pull together." Anansi, his mouth full of fufu in Akwamu, suddenly felt the rope go taut. His 8 eyes widened in horror as he heard both crowds counting down. "Pull on 3!" came the shout from Bonwire. "Let's test this rope now!" called the people of Akwamu. No, Anansi tried to shout through his mouthful of food, realizing too late that his deception was about to literally pull him apart. But his cry was muffled by the fufu, and neither village could hear his protest. "1!" shouted both crowds. "2! 3!" The rope pulled tight from both directions, hundreds of hands in each village yanking at once to honor his tradition. Snap! The force was so strong that it squeezed Anansi's waist until it was thin as a thread. "Ibu!" he cried, his voice echoing between the villages. His eyes bulged as his waist cinched tighter and tighter. The villagers from both sides followed the rope only to discover Anansi's deception. There he was, caught between 2 feasts, his belly bloated with food, and his waist squeezed paper thin. "So you tricked us?" the chiefs of both villages demanded. "Using the sacred funeral traditions of our people to fill your belly?" Anansi, his waist permanently damaged, could only hang his head in shame. The villagers drove him away, but the mark of his greed remained forever. From that day on, all spiders were born with thin waists, a reminder of Anansi's deception. They say that to this day, whenever you see a spider with its thin waist, remember this tale. Remember that greed and deception always leave their mark. Even the cleverest among us cannot escape the consequences of our actions. In times of hardship, it is not clever schemes we need, but kindness and sharing that will see us through. For what good is a full belly if it comes at the cost of an empty heart? If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Share it with others who might learn from Anansi's mistake. Remember, sometimes the cleverest plans can be undone by our own greed. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, may your heart be full of kindness rather than greed.